Hello, folks. Welcome back to our recorded lectures for ML103. So this is a new way of doing it. Hopefully it will work. It seemed to when I tested it, so please bear with me if there are any gaps in the recording or anything like that. So today's topic is Heresy and Heritage, Talos and his historical inspirations. This is a bit of a digression. Not a lot, just a little bit. We are still within the realm of Northern medievalism here, and that's the general topic that we're looking at. Talos and his historical inspirations are not specifically related to the Vikings, but they do shed some further light on the nature of Northern medievalism. And they also perhaps shed some light on the historical issue of Northern European peoples and their flexible approach to the adoption of Christianity, which is certainly something that we see among the Vikings. So it can provide some useful context for Norse Scandinavian attitudes towards Christianity. Plus, it's just a really cool topic, so I wanted to include it. It was one of the lectures that survived from the original Skyrim-only version of this course. So Talos is the deified form of the Emperor Tiber Septim. He is the ninth divine, and he is worshipped in particular by the Nords. Now, the banning of Talos worship is at the core of the grievances held by the Stormcloak rebels against the Empire. So Talos worship had been deemed a heresy and banned as part of the peace treaty with the Aldemari Dominion. The treaty was called the White Gold Concordat. And it was signed at a time in the Great War when the Aldemari had undergone a temporary reversal of fortune. The emperor was aware he was still losing, so he took advantage of the moment and offered a settlement. The settlement involved several concessions, giving a big chunk of the province of Hammerfell to the Dominion, disbanding the Blades, and banning the worship of Talos. So the last bit is what inflamed the Nords. And this eventually leads to something I'm not going to get into in detail called the Markarth incident, back in Skyrim, where Ulfric Stormcloak and a number of his followers attempted to intervene in a local rebellion and to uphold the worship of Talos. Now, Talos worship did continue in the province until the end of hostilities, when the Imperial legions go home and the Aldemari insisted that the Empire actually take steps to restrict Talos worship. So at this point, Ulfric and his followers are arrested and imprisoned. And when he's released, he returns to his family home of Windhelm and begins the rebellion. Now, there is an in-universe book called The Talos Mistake, which is supposedly written by Leonora Venatus, who's an Imperial liaison to the Dominion. And she claims in the book that the Empire did not agree to the ban on Talos worship simply to settle the treaty, but because it was the correct choice. Her argument was that deifying Tiber Septim took away from the greatness of his mortal deeds and discouraged people from worshipping the existing 8 divines. So what this does is it represents the imperial party line, and it portrays the Empire's concession to the Dominion as instead being a principled concern for the correct practice of the faith. It also establishes for the player that the worship of Talos has been officially declared a heresy, not just illegal. So that raises a good question. What is heresy in a religious sense? And what is it in the Middle Ages? I thought I might give you a little bit of background to that. Pardon me. The only downside to this type of recording is I cannot pause when I have a coughing fit. So, heresy, in a basic sense, is a set of ideas or beliefs at odds with the generally accepted beliefs and practices of a religion. So, established beliefs and practices are orthodox, heresy is not. And yes, this means that heresy is always in the eye of the beholder. You can use the term heresy against anyone who says, hey, are we sure that this is the way we should phrase this doctrine or carry out this ritual? Is it the best and most correct way? And the accusation of heresy was used against reformers, not just people who deliberately deviated from the mainstream. There's a popular perception that the medieval church dealt with heresies ruthlessly. And in some cases they did. and others simply did not. It depended on the nature of the heresy, it depended on the time, and it depended on the place. Certainly, they are more likely to resort to violence in the Central and later Middle Ages. In the early Middle Ages, Christianity is really still taking its shape, and a lot of what was deemed heresy was actually just academic disagreement. So, a good example of this are the Trinitarian heresies. So, the Trinity is the concept of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And this is mentioned in Scripture, but it's not explained anywhere. And, it's a tricky topic. What does it really mean? Are these three gods, one God in three forms? So the debate over this took a wide range of different forms, and a lot of people disagreed with the mainstream view of the Trinity. So there has to be debate to settle the definition. So I think it's a bit harsh to have called people heretics for disagreeing with their interpretations when there's no real authority. Now, interestingly, we have a better view of heresy in the early period in the East rather than the West. And we get dualists or Gnostics. So these are people who believed in a principle of good and a good God, and a principle of evil and an evil God. Basically, the evil was the material world, the good was the spiritual world. So this is sort of their way of explaining why bad things happen to good people. And groups like the Paulicians are what we call dualists. Now, towards the Central Middle Ages, as the Church grew more centralized and more powerful, a lot of thinkers started to question the direction it was taking. So, you have St. Augustine, who has this concept of the city of God from early in Christian history, and medieval thinkers tended to identify the Church with the heavenly city. But if the Church is the city of God, then its leaders have to be saintly men, and the Church should be focused around their personal holiness, rather than on institutional authority. And if that's the case, why is the Church so rich? Complicating this is the fact that the Church in the Central Middle Ages doesn't do a very good job of meeting the needs of new urban populations. It doesn't adapt well. People who live in urban areas want a different type of religious experience. They want preaching, they want personal involvement. So the old style of cathedral cleric or parish priest, they just would deliver the sacraments and hear confession and perform the standard offices. They're not up to what the urban populations want. So what happens is that city folk start turning to itinerant preachers. So wandering religious men who just, show up in the city square and start preaching. The Church thought they were fairly harmless at first, but over time it was clear to them that they were developing anti-clerical and anti-sacerdotal ideas. Now, these are two different things. Anti-clericalism is criticism of the clergy for not fulfilling their duties, whereas anti-sacerdotalism is a belief that denies that clergy have the right to do things like give the sacraments if they're not perfect people, for instance. So, to the Church, anti-clericalism is annoying and rude, but anti-sacerdotalism, on the other hand, is heresy, because you're actually denying the power of the clerical office. So, as an example, you have a group known as the Waldensians in southeastern France, led by Peter Waldo originally. They believed that the Church needed to practice apostolic poverty, which is to live like the apostles lived, to have very few personal possessions, to be humble, paupers of Christ in Latin. Now, of course, the Church is not going to give up all of its wealth, and the suggestion that it should is a good reason to start pointing at people like the Waldensians and shouting, "Heretic!" Now, they are driven from the cities by the Church, but they do survive in isolated regions of the Alps as late as the 17th century. And really, they're proto-Reformation folk, really, proto-Protestants. Now, one other type of heresy that we often see in this period is apocalypticism. So, especially around the beginning of the 11th century, there is a real fear about what the millennium will bring. And one of the more popular apocalyptic heretics was Joachim of Fiora. He believed that this was the age of the Antichrist. So if anybody's not heard of the Antichrist, it's a concept from the Bible of a leader who will precede the end of the world. And what Joachim believed was that the papacy was the Antichrist. And this idea becomes very popular with later reformers, including some of the early Protestants. This is what you call literally demonizing your opponent. It's a strategically useful doctrine because it allows opponents of the church to denounce even acts by the papacy that seem to be directed towards reforming the church. The Antichrist is wily, after all. That's part of the Antichrist game, is to look like a good leader. Now, how much of this is actually relevant to the Talos issue? Just the first bit, the Trinitarian bit. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on heresy since we were talking about the subject, and it is something that you wouldn't necessarily get unless you took a different type of medieval studies course. So let's look at the background for the inspiration for Talos. Okay, so before I do anything else, I should basically try and briefly explain what Arianism is to you, even though it's not really the nature of the heresy that's the true parallel here. It's complicated, by the way. So Arius believed that God the Father had always existed, but Christ the Son had not, that he had been created by God out of nothing before the beginning of time. And he was opposed by people like Alexander, his bishop in Alexandria, who said, no, if God had always existed and Christ had come from God's own substance, then he'd always existed as well. So what's the significance of this? Basically, Alexander and the mainstream church could point at Arius and say, you're arguing that Christ is a junior God. That violates the theology of the Trinity. Arius, on the other hand, could point back at them and say, you're arguing that Christ was a second God, because mainstream Trinitarian theology says that Christ was fully God. So basically, each side can accuse the other of polytheism. And there's nothing in Scripture or in previous theological consensus that answer the question. So this is an early heresy that's part of the codification of Christian belief in the early centuries. They tried to resolve it at the Council of Nicaea in 325 under the supervision of the Emperor Constantine. But they don't do it, and in fact they complicate the situation further because they issue an edict that goes too far in the other direction. Theology is like a pendulum. You can't let it swing too far in one direction or the other. Now, I just have to stop and tell you about this image in the slide. So, one of the really cool things about the Council of Nicaea is that there's a cool apocryphal story, so a story that's probably not true, where supposedly Arius was talking about his beliefs and defending himself in front of the assembled bishops, and a young clergyman, who doesn't look all that young in the image, I know, gets so incensed by the heresy that Arius is spinning that he jumps up out of his chair, runs across the room, and backhands Arius in front of the Emperor Constantine, who is not impressed because he thinks clergymen should behave better than that. So he throws this clergyman in jail for the night, and he has a vision of the Virgin Mary who tells him to go back, behave, and apologize. He does that, and everybody is very impressed by how much he seems to have matured over the course of the evening. So who was this clergyman who slapped the heretic? Well, his name was, we are told in this story, Nicholas of Myra, who happens to be the inspiration for Saint Nicholas. So basically, as I always like to tell my Medieval Studies 100 students, the Council of Nicaea, one of the greatest legends of it, is that this is where Santa Claus slapped a heretic upside the head. Anyways, so why does this all matter? Like, why did they argue about this so much? If Jesus is not God, but something closer to human, doesn't it make it a little easier to empathize with his death on the cross? So there are reasons why some theologians might have liked this interpretation. And certainly there are a lot of shades and nuances to this debate that I'm not really conveying to you, people who build on Arius' ideas as well. In a very general sense, this is part of the first part of our parallel to Talos. I mean, it matters very much with Talos that he was once a human being. His ascension to godhood gave all of his believers something to aspire to. But the fact that he started as a human being matters. His connection to the Nords matter. Now, the much more significant part of the parallel between Arianism and Talos has to do with the connection to a people. Talos is connected to the Nords. Likewise, Arianism has a special place amongst the so-called barbarian peoples of late antiquity, particularly the Goths. So the Goths were first converted to Christianity in the mid-4th century by Arian missionaries, including one by the name of Ulfilas, who also created a written script for the Gothic language and translated the Bible. The Goths carried Arian Christianity with them when they settled in the empire, and they passed it on to later groups like the Visigoths and the Ostrogoths. And the Ostrogoths in particular spread it to many other Germanic peoples. So it is practiced, despite the fact it's been declared a heresy as of 325, it's practiced in the 5th and the 6th century extensively through Western Europe, because it is seen as their religion, their cultural version of Christianity. And there might have been many reasons for this. The ability to worship in their own language, something connecting it to their own religion that we're unaware of, or just, a way to maintain a separate cultural identity when they're within the empire. So basically what we see is that the full parallel to the Talos controversy in Skyrim is the combination of a figure whose divinity is being debated and the identity-based cultural significance of the worship of this figure, especially when the fictional faith is being framed by the nature of the Nords' relationship to the Empire. So why do we need such a complicated bit of religious lore in this world? Victoria Cooper, who wrote about Skyrim, says that, quote, cultures and historical settings require aspects of religion and spirituality in their societies to engender depth. And she points out that religion is seen as a, quote, clear marker of pre-modern society. Now, she thinks it's set dressing, that it's not important. I don't know, I kind of disagree with that. I mean, yes, a lot of the quests having to do with Talos are fetch quests, but you can choose to treat them with greater importance on the role-playing level. So, Nords who still honor Talos can only do so surreptitiously. This explains why we see so few public performances of religious practices in gameplay. The Dragonborn can accept quests from NPCs, including one where he or she has to find an amulet of Talos for the bereaved sister of a man who was unjustly executed for helping Ulfric. She is refusing to return to the temple without a way to honor Talos in memory of her brother, so she wants to wear the amulet underneath her clothing. Another quest where the Dragonborn has to kind of maneuver around the ban is when he's asked to take the horn of the High King, Torrig, to a shrine of Talos, and he is asked by the High King's widow, Eliseth. Eliseth is the Jarl of Solitude, and she's the Emperor's preferred candidate to be the new High Queen of Skyrim. It's really interesting, she's bound to the Empire. Her fate is in their hands, basically, and yet she still feels it necessary to honor her husband with this gesture to Talos. Now, if the Dragonborn takes the horn and delivers it to the shrine and then stops to pray, they are attacked by a Thalmor agent with orders to kill anyone who was worshipping at the shrine on site. And there are actually other cases of this throughout Skyrim. You can come across another shrine of Talos that seems to have been the scene of a massacre, where several Talos worshippers died fighting a Thalmor, and the Thalmor, according to a letter on his body, had been led to the shrine by an informant. So these quests may be small in scope, but they contribute to the overarching story of the Civil War. They present Talos worship as an outlawed faith, one that is frustrating its followers. So if you're playing a Stormcloak Dragonborn, you can get pissed off at this too. If you're playing an Imperial Legion aligned Dragonborn, you can still be like, why are they doing this? What is the point of this? Why not let people worship as they choose? And you can actually have conversations with clergy about Talos and the ban, which sort of flesh out the religious world of Skyrim. So the priestess at the Temple of the Divines in Solitude claims that she's not bothered by the removal of the Shrine of Talos. She says, Tiber Septim was a great man, but it doesn't make him a god. But you can also overhear a conversation between her and her husband, the high priest. And they're concerned because there's so much less attendance at the temple And they admit that, yeah, women still come to look for wisdom and blessings from the hearth goddesses, but you see so many fewer men. And the husband's like, well, maybe it's just that they're all away at war, but really they're not coming because they can't worship the ninth divine. Now, if you compare that to the priestess at the Temple of Talos in Windhelm, Jorah is a fierce defender of the Nords' traditional faith. And she says, we are, the temple's bursting at the seams when the time comes for service, as all of the leading citizens of Windhelm are coming and joining us. So there's an implicit comparison here between the faith as a dwindling force in solitude and a thriving one in Windhelm. And this emphasizes the key role of Talos worship in Nord cultural identity. And especially if you're playing a Nord Dragonborn, this gives you some food for thought, no matter what side you're on in the Civil War. So what do we take away from this for our purposes in ML103? So historically speaking, Northern peoples are open to new religions, but they wanted their own practices. Religion among kin or tribal-based societies develops connections to group identity. If your beliefs are part of your group identity, you're going to cling to them much more firmly, especially if you're using those beliefs to differentiate yourself from other groups, so the Goths from the Romans. Also, the centralization and standardization of religious practices is very difficult in a medieval world or a medievalist world. It's not something that a central church can easily dictate, because if you don't have rapid communication, how do you watch the likely heretics? So, this is why you don't see much talk of heresy in the early Middle Ages, because there's so much less travel and communication that, people do their own thing in corners of Europe all over the place, and no one ever knows. There are some of the most interesting variations on heretical beliefs that you find in random corners of Europe. There was one case where they worshipped a greyhound who had saved a baby from a snake and been killed because the father thought the greyhound had attacked the baby. That's St. Gwynefort, very interesting saint. Anyways, as I said, a bit of a digression, but it does raise some interesting ideas for the purposes of religion in a northern medieval or medievalist setting. And since that's something we're going to be looking at in more detail in the other two lectures this week, I thought it was worth keeping this. Plus, I have a soft spot for this topic because this was one of the first historical pieces that I looked at when I started studying video games in the first place. So a little bit of nostalgia going on here. All right, we'll be back soon with another.